Chapter 21. All Alone. The raising of 11 children had taken a far heavier toll on our house than it had on Mother. Mother was still slim, quick, and erect, but the house was tired and sagging. The stairs were grooved, and the spokes were missing from the banisters. The furnace, never too efficient, now could be coaxed to breathe heat only into the central rooms. The floors had been scuffed beyond repair, and initials had been carved in some of the woodwork. One of the columns of the portico had begun to rot, causing the roof to angle downward like the tilt of an old rake's hat. The year Jane was to go to college, Mother agreed with us that it was time for her to move out of the house. We thought she'd try to sell it, but she didn't like the idea of other people living in it, and she knew it wouldn't bring much money anyways. Besides needing repairs, it was built primarily for a family with 10 or 12 children. People who could afford to run such a large house didn't have families that size anymore. Mother called for bids and had the house torn down. She supervised the demolition herself. If she felt any pangs as the workmen stripped off the walls and laid open the interior, she kept them to herself. The motion study equipment, the files, the double desk she and Dad had used to perfect their original time-saving experiments went to the laboratory at Purdue. The mahogany furniture she had had since her wedding was sent to a cabinet maker to remove the scars and stains of a generation of children and several generations of dogs and miscellaneous livestock. Mother's finances had improved immeasurably as more consulting jobs were offered her, and now she came into an inheritance from her family estate. With Bob partly through college and only Jane to go, Mother could retire if she wanted and relax for the rest of her life. After years of working and scrimping, she could have fur coats, a maid to bring her breakfast in bed, even a limousine and a chauffeur if she had wanted them. But Mother didn't want them, and she had no idea of stopping work. Her and Jane moved into a middle-priced apartment in Montclair. The old furniture gave it a familiar appearance to Mother's new living and dining room, except that everything was tidy, polished, and reupholstered. She started using her best silver and china, and she had packed away years before when Anne was starting to walk and pulling things off tables. A cleaning woman came twice a week, but Mother and Jane did their own cooking. With unrestricted use of her own kitchen, Mother soon became a good cook. If Jane had let Mother have her way, Jane would have been the one who had breakfast in bed. As it was, no matter how early Jane got up, her eggs and toast appeared on the table about the time she walked into the dining room. Then Jane left for college and Mother was alone. None of us liked the idea of that. We thought that anyone who had raised 11 youngsters always needed children in the house. Besides, it seemed only right that after all the years she had looked out for us, we should start looking out for her. We hadn't had a meeting of our family council for years, but when Anne came next to Montclair from Cleveland for a visit, we called a meeting of the council to discuss Mother. The council had been one of Dad's ideas, and he had patterned it after an employee boards in an industry. The council had decided matters of policy, such as the size of allowances and the apportionment of house and yard work. Dad, as a self-appointed chairman, had his own set of parliamentary rules and was not above launching a one-man filibuster or bottling up appropriation bills in committee. But for the most part, the majority ruled. We didn't want Mother to know about the meeting to discuss her, so we held it at Ernestine's house. It wasn't a formal session. No one presided with a gavel in hand and a pitcher of ice water at his elbow, as Dad used to. But we did sit in our old positions around Ern's dining room table. We still looked on Anne, now a matron in her late 30s, as automatically in charge when she was at home, and she sat at the head of the table. We agreed, first of all, that neither Mother would move in with one of our families or that one of our families would move in with her. We felt that what had kept Mother going through the years was the goal of sending all of us through college. With that goal as achieved, there might not be any incentive to keep going, and it would mean Mother would have to make an adjustment. We thought we'd better start preparing her in advance for the adjustment. We knew that many women in their 60s had years of experience in taking things easy. They played bridge and went to talk about movies and their friends, or they sat on rockers with cats on their laps. Mother didn't know how to do any of these things, but we thought perhaps we could help her learn. There was something else that all of us took into consideration, but hesitated to put into words. Suppose Mother would want to keep working, but as she got older, the job and lecture offers should become less and less frequent. There was a rule at Purdue that faculty members had to retire when they reached 70. and that wasn't many years in the future. The council appointed Ernestine to talk with Mother about moving in with one of us. If we could get Mother to do that, to forget the idea that she might be imposing on someone, she would be interested in helping raise another generation. Then Jane's graduation would just be another incident. But when Ernestine put the proposition up to Mother the next day, she might as well saved her breath. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, dear," said Mother, "but I couldn't do it." "Of course you could," Ernestine told her. "There's no use in being stubborn." Mother may have thought it was the pot calling the kettle black, but realized the intentions were good anyway. "As long as Bob and Jane are in college," she said, "I want them to know that we, just they and I, have our own home. That's something that all of you children have had, and it's important for them, and for me too." "How about when they're out of college and married?" Ernestine asked. "I've been thinking about that, and I don't know. Your father's mother lived with us for quite a few years after we were married, and I was fond of her, and I think she was of me. But I don't think either of us really liked the situation. I don't know." So Mother continued to live alone, except when Bob and Jane were home on vacation, and we were still worried about her. World War II came then. 5 of the boys were in it and overseas. Mother was older, suddenly, and sometimes she was tired. She wrote each one of the boys every day and waited mornings for the mailman before she went to New York. She never talked about the war or how battles were going. Telegrams made her nervous. She held them up to the light before they opened. Now there were new demands on her time. We could see there would be no question about her not being busy as long as the war lasted. She was working with the War Manpower Commission. The government was using her studies on motions of the disabled to help rehabilitate amputees. War Industries wanted the latest time-saving techniques. Many of the graduates of her motion study course she had discontinued some years before were, when the engineering jobs started to come in, had important production jobs and sought her out for consolation. Walt Disney made a training film in Technicolor of the process chart. She journeyed to Providence to help christen a Liberty ship named for Dad. She went to Chapel Hill for Bob's graduation, and finally the day arrived when she boarded a train to Ann Arbor for Jane's. That was a special occasion for Mother. She rode in a lower berth, and from that time on, when the space was available, she rode in lowers. She and Anne sat together with the spectators when Jane received her diploma. It should have been a happy occasion because it symbolized the fulfillment of something Mother had promised herself. But when Anne thought about the sacrifices that Mother had made to keep that promise, a lump settled in her throat. Mother's youngest, handsome with her mortarboard cocked debonairly over one ear, bounded nonchalantly across the stage. She took the hand of the man who presented it, possibly giving the hand a parting squeeze, and rejoined her class. Anne dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "Jane doesn't appreciate what Mother's done for her," she thought. "None of us appreciate it. I didn't appreciate it at the time either. I thought I did, but I didn't really." Jane turned around in her seat, spotted them, and waved the diploma triumphantly aloft. "I guess Dad would be proud," Anne said, turning to Mother. Mother didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her face, in repose, hadn't changed much through the years. There was the new nose, of course. Anne waited a moment and nudged her slightly. "I declare you're a great one," Anne teased. "Work a whole lifetime to send your children through college, then go to sleep when the final great moment arrives." Mother opened her eyes. "I wasn't asleep," she said softly. "I was saying thank you." Both Jane and Bob were married in a year or so. All of us married young and soon had children of our own. And then the war was over, and the boys began to come home. Mother seemed to shed some of the years that had piled so suddenly upon her. She thought it would be a good idea to hold a family reunion so that all of us could see the boys and that the 3 newest grandchildren could be christened together in our church in Montclair. We converged from various parts of the country. Some of us from out of town, and our family stayed at Mother's apartment. Others moved in with those who lived in or near Montclair. Extra leaves were put back into the dining room table, and Mother's ice box was full of baby bottles again. The good china was taken out of circulation and put up on high shelves. And as Mother bathed and powdered our children and gave them their bottle, she seemed gayer and happier than we remembered seeing her since Dad's death. When it came time to do the dishes at night, she'd take 3 or 4 of the older grandchildren back into the kitchen and they'd dry while she washed. We'd hear a lot of giggling and know Mother was telling them stories about when we were young. Sometimes they'd sing the old songs that Mother had taught us, and we had taught them. We whispered to each other that we couldn't understand why, since Mother seemed to be enjoying our visit so much, she wouldn't want to move in with one of us. On the day of the christening, we assembled at the apartment and walked the 2 blocks to the church. Besides Mother and the 11 of us, there were our husbands and wives, and 15 of our children, including the 3 babies who were to be baptized. 2 pews had been reserved for us at the front of the large Gothic church. We walked down the center aisle, as quietly as we could, but there were so many of us, and Mother knew so many people, that our entrance created a good deal of attention. Mother, ramrod straight and immensely dignified, led the delegation. She looked as though she was proud of us and proud of her grandchildren. We hoped she was. The service started, the organ music rolled out loudly, and there was a hush and the opening prayer. 3 of our boys and their wives stepped forward with their babies. The clock turned backward for some of us. When we were young, there was a christening in the family almost every year, and although Dad had much more experience with baptisms than the average man, they always made him nervous and irritable. It wasn't just the christening he objected to. He objected to going to church for any reason. He kept saying he was a religious man and had nothing against churches, that he thought it was fine that Mother and all of us went regularly. But he never went himself unless there was a reason, such as a christening. And even then Mother had to prod him all the way. Few martyrers ever looked more persecuted as they approached the stake than did Dad when, with a baby under his arm, he left the house for a christening. This piecemeal business of christening them at a time is the height of inefficiency, he stormed to Mother. It's by jingoed indignation, by jingo. Maybe so, dear, Mother would soothe him, but I don't want to raise a house full of heathens. One in the family is enough. Me? A heathen? Dad would yelp. You know I'm a religious man, but this is my final piecemeal christening. After this one, we're going to wait until the last of them is born, and then we'll get it all over with one efficient ceremony. We can talk about that when the next one arrives, Mother would smile. That's what you always say, and I wind up in church with a new baby on my hands. Dad never had much confidence about holding babies when they were small. He was afraid he might hurt them, so he didn't grasp them firmly, and they'd wiggle until their dresses were up around their heads. When this happened, Dad would try to straighten out their clothes and get things so twisted around that Mother would have to come to the rescue. When he stood with Mother at the front of the church, he always looked as if he wasn't quite sure whether he was holding the baby right side up, and he seemed worried he might cause the minister to make an embarrassing blunder. We older children would be sitting with our various Sunday school classes in the galleries on each side of the altar, dreading what we knew was coming, and yet knowing we couldn't help doing it. We were always disgraced ourselves at the christenings of our younger brothers and sisters. As the baby squirmed in Dad's arms, while he kept peering down into the dress to make sure the head was still on top, the situation would seem more and more audacious to us. We'd think about how Dad had stormed beforehand, and how he was going to storm afterwards at Sunday dinner. Then it would happen, and we would disgrace ourselves again. Suddenly, one of us would explode in a snorting giggle. You couldn't hold it back. It was embarrassing, but it was just too funny, and there wasn't a thing you could do about it. Another one of us, sitting with another class and vowing that this time he could control himself, would hear the snort, and suddenly he would explode too. Finally, all of us would be giggling, and people down in the congregation would crane their necks to see what was causing the disturbance. Since Dad went to church for the christening of his own children only, he comforted himself with the thought that a few jackasses in the balcony always giggled whenever a child was baptized. And although this belief was completely erroneous, we did our best not to dispel it. Worst man-eater congregation I ever saw, he'd complain afterwards. They always seem to think that a christening is like a vaudeville show. Bob's baby was a wiggler. As Bob and his wife and the 2 other couples stood in front of the minister, the dress of Bob's daughter started to slide over her head. With considerable concern, Bob looked down. Just for a minute, it was Dad all over. Just for a minute, the older ones, who were sitting with Mother, were little children again, up in the galleries with their Sunday school classes. Ernestine had a horrible thought. Suppose she should suddenly start to giggle. It was bad enough when a child did it, but suppose an adult herself, the mother of 2 children, should do it. It was out of the question, of course. Adults can control themselves. They simply don't make scenes like that. Bob's daughter wiggled some more, and Bob looked down to find her head again. Ernestine snorted. She put her hand over her mouth, but the giggle came out through her nose, and you could hear it all over church. Ernestine's husband and children looked at her with amazement. Mother hunched her shoulders instinctively and kept her eyes straight ahead, as if Ernestine were someone else's daughter that had got into the group by mistake. Ernestine tried biting her lip, but it was no use. She sat there and giggled. So did the rest of us, in a series of moist explosions. So, although she still denies it, did Mother. There are other witnesses to prove it. And so did the congregation, and so did the minister. He had been at the church for years, and he recalled the old days. Fortunately, the christening service had not quite started. He stopped everything and laughed until he had to dig under his vestments to get a handkerchief. Finally, there was quiet again, and the 3 babies were baptized. The minister climbed back to the pulpit and looked down at us. We weren't too happy about the way we had behaved. I don't know as if I'd want to go through it all over again, and have the 11 of you up on the balcony every Sunday, he began. But because I'm not as young as I used to be. But it's good to have you here on a visit, and it's good to see you again together. Mighty good. We glanced at Mother to see how she was taking it, and for the first time we knew for certain why she lived alone. We knew that, as glad as she was to have us home, she lived alone because she liked it. For Mother was nodding in agreement. She didn't want to go through with it all over again either. 1 generation was enough. Mother looked as if the minister had taken the words right out of her mouth. Mother still lives in the same apartment. She retired from Purdue when she reached 70, but she is busier than ever today. Not long ago, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and the American Management Association awarded to her and to Dad posthumously the Gnat Medal for pioneer work in management and the development of the principles and techniques of motion study. And the American Women's Association named her Woman of the Year. Even those of us on the West Coast see her 4 or 5 times a year, because she has a good many lectures there. Those who live in or near Montclair drop by the apartment fairly often after dinner, when she's home, and to sort and forward her mail when she's away. Before she leaves town on business trips, Mother makes out an itinerary listing the hotels and the person's houses where she will be stopping. And at the bottom of the itinerary it always says, "I know you'll call me if you need me."